the New Testament begins with four biographies, all of the same man, Jesus. So why do we have four, and do all four of these agree? Let's talk about that on today's edition of Theology Thursday. So we have 39 books of the Old Testament. They were completed somewhere around 400 BC. And then during those 400 years, there are no more biblical books that are written. Really don't know about a lot of prophets. We know a good deal about the history. But then John the Baptist shows up on the scene. He's the forerunner to Jesus. He's the first of the what we call the new prophets, so to speak. And then, of course, we have Jesus and his life, his death, burial, and resurrection. He commissions his apostles to go into all the world, and then he ascends back to heaven. Later, a 12th apostle is appointed by Jesus to replace Judas Iscariot, who was the son of perdition, as the Bible says. And he also is commissioned, and so from there we get the rest of the New Testament written, mostly by the Apostle Paul, but some by John and Peter and James and Jude and so forth. So what I want to talk about today is these first four Gospels, these four biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They comprise a significant part of the New Testament. All four of them look at the life of Jesus, and it's interesting that when you look at them, trying to piece together from these four different accounts the life of Jesus can be complex and complicated. And there are a number of scholars over the centuries who have harmonized, trying to put in order from this gospel and this gospel and kind of reconstruct the entire life of Jesus between them. As a matter of fact, in my digital library, here is just an example of some of the books that have been done to attempt to put the life of Jesus in one complete storyline. And so you can see there have been a number of authors who have written what's called a harmony of the Gospels. So let's talk about it. First of all, we have four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we only have one story, and that is the story of Jesus, and that's most important to remember because all of four of these authors are very intentional about presenting the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ when he was here on the earth. Now that raises the question, why God, in his infinite wisdom, would decide to give us four biographies of Jesus rather than just one comprehensive life story of Jesus. And so not claiming to know the mind of God, I'm not going to say I know exactly why, but there are some things that I think are significant about having four different Gospels. One of those is that they give different perspectives. They have a different way of looking at the life of Jesus. Matthew walked with him. Matthew had been a tax collector, hated by the Jews, and really not cared for much by the Romans either because he was a traitor to his own people. Tax collectors would be commissioned by the Roman Empire to collect local taxes. And then anything they taxed above and beyond that, they got to keep for themselves. So they typically were pretty wealthy, but they were also considered scumbags because they were taking advantage of their own people who were being oppressed by the Roman Empire. So tax collectors were pretty much outcasts, and yet we have an outcast who's called by Jesus to become an apostle. And so we have Matthew and his own personal experience, but also the fact that Matthew is Jewish. And so we have a very Jewish perspective. Mark, on the other hand, probably was written by Mark, but is sometimes called the Gospel of Peter because it's believed that Peter gave Mark much of his information. But Mark is a second-hand account. And Mark has a very, very intense focus on Jesus ministering to people. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is always touching people. He's always moving to get to the next people of need. And so we have a different perspective in Mark than we do in Matthew, kind of a focus on a king. And then Luke is a researched gospel, a researched biography of the life of Jesus. In fact, Luke probably was a Gentile. And so we find this lengthy account of the birth of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke because Luke, as a doctor, is very interested in Jesus and his origins and probably interviewed Mary to get his gospel put together. And then John has a much more theological perspective. John does not recount as much of the life of Jesus as he does the character and the deity of Jesus and the majesty and glory and much of his teachings. We find very lengthy talks, if I can use that term, by Jesus. There are fewer miracles recorded in John than in the other Gospels. And so each of them gives a different perspective on the life of Jesus. And this is a good thing. If you take a history class, you don't want to just read one account of someone's life. You can read some different accounts because they kind of have a different perspective or different accounts of a particular event and just kind of get some different ways of viewing it and looking at it. Now, when we look at the four Gospels, the majority is the same. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, does much of his ministry in Galilee. We find the feeding of the 5,000 in a couple of Gospels. We find a lot of the teachings of Jesus that are very, very similar or the same in the Gospels, the narratives, his biographies. Luke has a lot more parables than the others, but they're for the most part recount the same story. They all have the death and resurrection of Jesus and that sort of thing. However, there are a few discrepancies between them that don't seem to fit, and so scholars have sought over the years to harmonize how these apparent discrepancies can be reconciled, because if we believe the Bible is inspired by God and it's without error, then they would be able to harmonize. So I'll give you, some of these are very easy to figure out. For example, there are some different names. Some of the apostles go by one name in one gospel and by another name in another gospel. I don't see that as a discrepancy. Some people call me Brother Paul, some people call me Dr. Smith, and some people call me Pastor, and one person who's very important to me calls me Honey. And so there are actually different names that I go by, and depending on who I was with, they would introduce me. This is our pastor. How you doing, Pastor? And that's just what they call me, Pastor. If they see me out somewhere, they say, hey, Pastor. Other people call me by name, Paul. Students call me Dr. Smith because that's the way it works in academic setting. And so different names being used is really no big deal. Again, it's just different perspective and probably how they knew people. The number of people involved. For example, the resurrection accounts. Some have the ladies show up, and then others have just Mary there. Probably what happened was several ladies showed up. Once they encounter the angel, the rest of them run to tell the apostles, but Mary remains behind. Not Mary, the mother of Jesus. Half women in the Bible times are called Mary. There are a whole bunch of them in the New Testament. She stays behind and encounters Jesus herself. And so there are differences in those. And those, again, just have with perspective and what's being emphasized. So those are very easy to harmonize as well. Now, we do have a couple of events that do raise questions. We have the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. Matthew indicates those are two separate events. Some of the other Gospels don't have the feeding of the 4,000, and some see this as a repeat with a different number. But no, Matthew makes it clear. So because the others don't have it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that they didn't need to tell another account of feeding a large number of people, again, because of their perspective. Now, one of the ones that does raise a lot of question is the location of the cleansing of the temple. Was it early in Jesus' ministry or late in his ministry? Because we find it in different Gospels in different locations. So there are a couple of ways of harmonizing that. One is that Jesus did it, and for emphases, the different Gospel writers put it in different locations in their Gospel, not really intent on trying to create a chronological life, but to put forth what Jesus was doing. The other is that Jesus ministered for at least 3 years, maybe 4, depending on how many Passovers, and we won't get into all that because there are a few questions there. But assuming it was a 3-year ministry that Jesus had, he easily could have cleansed the temple at the beginning and then the necessity to do it again at the end. Now, one of the things that we discover is that it's really interesting the way that the gospel writers arrange the material. I find this quite fascinating and pretty cool, actually. So Luke has like a big section where we have a lot of parables. Matthew's gospel is very structured. We have this lengthy Sermon on the Mount. Much of what we find in the Sermon on the Mount, we find in the Gospel of Luke, but not in one sermon. It's kind of spread in various places in his gospel account. Mark and John have nothing about the birth of Jesus. Mark just starts off with Jesus coming down to be baptized by John the Baptist. Mark's gospel is shorter. It's much quicker. It doesn't have nearly the material that the others do. And so the fact that we find a lot of, maybe not as many events, but a lot of the teachings and things of Jesus in different locations in the Gospels, I think is very important and very instructive for us. Because the reality is, if someone's going to teach for 3 years, the odds of them teaching all brand new material every time is probably zero. We would expect for important themes to occur over and over again. Look, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but I've been a pastor for 38 years, and I've not just preached on the resurrection once, and well, that was enough, that's good enough, it's done. It's important. It gets repeated over and over and over again. The references to the Ten Commandments come up repeatedly in my sermons. If you lead a Bible study or have been a part of a Bible study, you know that some themes just come up regularly because they're important. And so the fact that they occur in different places in the four Gospels tells us that Jesus didn't just teach this and was done. Jesus repeated some of these themes over and over and over again. These teachings came up over and over again. And so that tells us, hey, this is pretty important. And it tells us something about the way we teach. And this will particularly be true with children. You don't just tell them once not to cross the street without looking. You repeat it numerous times, at various times, because it's important. And so the fact that many of these teachings of Jesus occur all in kind of various places in the four Gospels, the four biographies of Jesus, tells us that he did this a lot in his life. When we put the Gospels together, we get really an amazing, cohesive picture of the life of Jesus. Currently, there are a couple of questions that we have about maybe the order of some events and how they fit, but only a couple. Again, because the Bible is inspired, they fit together like pieces of a puzzle to give us a whole and complete picture of the life of Jesus. So I want to finish this discussion with one thing. What this also tells us is that you and I probably gravitate towards a particular gospel as being our favorite one. I know a man that loved the Gospel of John. He was a very gentle and loving man, and John is a very gentle and loving book for much of it. He talks more about the love of God and the love of Jesus than the other apostles. My personal favorite, if you know me, this wouldn't surprise you, is the Gospel of Mark. We dispense with all the pleasantries at the beginning. We get right to it. Mark's very direct. Jesus is always moving. He's always doing something. Mark is a very high-energy gospel. He uses the word immediately more than all the other gospels put together. He's always doing something straightway or immediately, depending on which translation you use. So I like Mark. It's quick. It's to the point. Jesus is doing what he has been called to do and completes his ministry. So having these different perspectives also, I think, kind of pulls us to a gospel that we particularly like because it reflects much of our personality. So look, I hope you have a great day, and I hope you remember that the most important thing with four Gospels is that they tell the one story, the most important story, and that's the story of the life of our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lived for us, died for us, and rose again for us. So God bless you. Have a great day.